The dog, a medium-sized black shepherd mix, had clearly endured more than just the harsh weather. Its body was thin, ribs visible through its damp fur, and its paws were raw and cracked. Lucas could feel the bones beneath the dog's weight as he carried it, but he also felt something else, life, however faint, still pulsing. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he navigated the icy slope leading back toward the town. The trees loomed around him like quiet witnesses. Every few steps, Lucas paused to check if the dog was still breathing. Its breaths were shallow, and its eyes had stopped opening, but he refused to panic. There was no time for that. The blizzard picked up, sending gusts of snow swirling like ghostly fingers. Lucas tightened his grip and kept moving, speaking gently into the dog's ear. "I don't know who you are or where you came from," he said, "but I'm not letting you die out here." His muscles ached, but something inside him, deeper than duty, kept him going. Maybe it was the way the dog hadn't whimpered or flinched, even in such pain. Maybe it was the memory of his own childhood pet, lost to the wilderness long ago. Or maybe it was just that he couldn't bear to see a living thing discarded like it didn't matter. It took over an hour to reach the edge of town, and by then, Lucas's face was red from windburn and his fingers were numb. The vet clinic sat on the corner of Main Street, its windows fogged and dark. Lucas nearly dropped to his knees when he saw a light still glowing inside. He pounded on the glass, using the last of his strength. A minute later, the door swung open, revealing Dr. Myers, the town's only veterinarian. She was in her 50s, with tired eyes and a face that had seen too many late-night emergencies. She looked at Lucas, then at the bundle in his arms, and immediately stepped aside. "Bring him in," she said. They rushed the dog into the back room and laid him on a steel table. Dr. Myers didn't waste a second. Her assistant, a young girl named Kayla, appeared in scrubs and gloves within moments, prepping the tools. "Gunshot wound," Lucas explained breathlessly. "Left in the woods, no collar, barely breathing." Dr. Myers nodded, already listening to the dog's heartbeat. "He's freezing. Hypothermia, blood loss, infection. This isn't going to be easy." "Do whatever you can," Lucas said. "Please." He stepped back, watching as they worked. Warm fluids were attached. Blankets and heating pads were brought in. Kayla cleaned the wound, her hands steady despite the rush. The dog didn't cry out. He was still, eyes closed, as if trusting these strangers without question. For a long time, Lucas stood in the corner, jacket soaked, arms crossed tightly. Memories of past rescue missions flashed through his mind, but none had hit him quite like this. He couldn't explain it, but he felt a strange connection to this animal, as if saving him meant something bigger. An hour passed, then two. Finally, Dr. Myers stepped away, pulling off her gloves with a sigh. "He's stable for now," she said, still critical. "We've cleaned the wound, started antibiotics, and raised his body temperature slightly. He has a long road ahead, but he made it through the night. That's something." Lucas felt the tension in his chest release slightly. He approached the table and looked at the dog, still unconscious, but breathing. "What are you going to call him?" Kayla asked, glancing at him. Lucas hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Shadow." He came out of nowhere, like a shadow in the snow. Dr. Myers nodded. "Shadow it is." That night, Lucas didn't go home. He pulled up a chair and sat beside Shadow's table, refusing to leave. Every hour, he checked on him. Every time the dog stirred, Lucas whispered, "You're safe now." Outside, the snow kept falling, but inside the small clinic, something had shifted. A broken animal had been given a second chance, not just because someone found him, but because someone refused to walk away. The snowstorm passed overnight, leaving behind a quiet stillness across town. Blankets of snow clung to rooftops, and morning light reflected off every surface like a frozen mirror. Inside the vet clinic, the air was still warm, but heavy with tension. Lucas hadn't slept. He remained by Shadow's side, watching his shallow breathing and the slow drip of IV fluid that hung above the steel table. The dog's body remained motionless, but occasionally his paw twitched, or his ears flicked in response to a sound. It gave Lucas hope, just enough to stay alert, not let fatigue win. Dr. Myers entered with a mug of coffee and a gentle nod. "You need rest," she said. "I'm fine," Lucas replied, voice dry and quiet. "You won't help him by collapsing," she added. He finally took the mug and nodded gratefully. "I just can't leave him. Not yet." As the vet checked Shadow's vitals, Lucas thought back to the previous night. He kept replaying the moment he found the dog, the way its eyes had opened, just slightly, as if it knew someone had come. That connection wasn't imagined. It had changed something inside him. Lucas had saved animals before, rescued hikers, even found a lost child during a blizzard 2 winters ago. But this felt different. Shadow wasn't just wounded. He had been left behind, purposefully abandoned and hurt. That made it personal. Around noon, Shadow let out a small, broken whine. Lucas shot to his feet. Dr. Myers turned quickly and leaned in. "Come on, buddy," she whispered. "Let's see those eyes." Shadow's eyelids fluttered, and for the first time since his rescue, they slowly opened. His gaze was cloudy, uncertain, but alive. Lucas crouched beside him, gently placing a hand on the dog's paw. "There you are," he said softly. "Welcome back." The vet smiled, but she didn't sugarcoat the reality. "He's awake, but he's not out of danger. His wound is clean, but he's weak, very weak. If he fights, he has a chance." Lucas didn't hesitate. "Then I'll fight with him." For the next few days, Lucas practically lived at the clinic. He slept on a bench, took quick showers at a friend's nearby cabin, and spent every waking moment with Shadow. The staff grew used to seeing him there. Some offered meals, others brought toys or blankets for the dog. The story of the rescue quietly spread through town. Locals began to ask questions. Where was he found? Do you think it was an accident? Any idea who did it? Lucas didn't know. He hadn't seen any tags, and no one had come forward. But a few rumors began to surface, stories of a dog seen near a remote hunting cabin weeks earlier. Talk of someone moving out in a rush, leaving behind what they didn't want to take. Still, Lucas didn't focus on that. His priority was Shadow's healing. Each day, Shadow grew a little stronger. He began lifting his head, then drinking water on his own. He even managed a tail wag when Lucas walked in with food. His recovery wasn't easy, but it was steady. Every gain, no matter how small, felt like a victory. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after the rescue, Lucas opened the kennel door and sat beside Shadow on the floor. The dog struggled, but he leaned his head against Lucas's leg, eyes closed, breathing slow and peaceful. "You're going to make it," Lucas whispered. "You already beat the cold. You already beat the silence." And in that moment, Lucas knew something with certainty. He hadn't just saved a life. He had found a companion, one who had endured cruelty and pain, but who never gave up. As the town outside continued with its routines, something quiet and powerful was happening behind the clinic walls. A broken dog was learning to trust again, and a lonely man, once searching for meaning in the woods, was finding it in the eyes of an animal who refused to let go. By the 3rd week, Shadow was strong enough to stand. It wasn't graceful, his back leg wobbled, and he winced slightly with every step, but he stood. That one moment drew a wave of emotion through the small clinic room. Lucas smiled for the first time in days, while Kayla clapped softly from the doorway. "You've got guts," Lucas whispered, kneeling beside him. Shadow licked his hand in response, eyes bright and alert. There was no doubt anymore, this dog wasn't just surviving. He was coming back to life. Dr. Myers entered soon after with Shadow's latest test results. "He's healing better than expected. No infection, his appetite's strong, and we might even avoid surgery on the hind leg. You did right by him." Lucas didn't respond immediately. He was staring at Shadow, who now sat up beside him like a soldier recovering from battle. "He did it," Lucas finally said. "I just carried him." Dr. Myers gave him a look, a mixture of pride and warning. "He's going to need more than medical care moving forward. This kind of trauma doesn't leave easily." Lucas knew that. Shadow sometimes woke with a sharp bark, startled by distant sounds. Sudden movements made him cower, but he always came back to Lucas's side, every single time. The bond between them was no longer just about rescue. It was loyalty earned, not expected. A few days later, the clinic cleared Shadow for release. He wasn't ready for open trails or long walks, but he could leave the medical care behind. Lucas didn't even need to think about it. He signed the adoption papers before they were finished printing. As he opened the back of his truck, Shadow climbed in with effort, then turned in a slow circle and laid down with his head on a folded blanket Lucas had placed there. It was the same jacket he'd been wrapped in during the rescue. Back at Lucas's cabin, things were quiet and simple. The walls were lined with nature photos, many taken during Lucas's former ranger days. A fireplace crackled in the corner, and the wooden floor creaked gently beneath their feet. Shadow sniffed cautiously around the room before curling up near the fire. Lucas watched him from across the room. The storm that had started their story was gone now, but something else had taken its place, a calmness neither of them had known in a long time. The first week home wasn't without struggle. Shadow had nightmares. Sometimes he refused to eat. One afternoon, a loud engine backfiring nearby made him bolt under the porch, trembling. Lucas didn't drag him out. He sat on the steps, talking softly, waiting for Shadow to emerge on his own terms. And he did. By the second week, Shadow had started following Lucas from room to room. By the third, he was waking him up in the morning with a cold nose pressed to his hand. There was still pain in his movements, but not in his spirit. One morning, as Lucas sipped his coffee and flipped through an old field journal, he noticed Shadow sitting by the door, tail thumping. "You want to go?" Lucas asked, raising an eyebrow. Shadow barked softly. Once Sand stood. Lucas smiled, grabbed his coat, and clipped on a leash. Their first walk was short, just down to the frozen creek and back. But to Lucas, it felt like miles of progress. The story of Shadow's rescue had quietly spread around town. A local blogger picked it up, followed by a small regional paper. One headline read, "Stranger rescues dog left for dead, finds lifelong friend instead." People began reaching out. Someone left a new bed on Lucas's porch. Another dropped off homemade treats and a handwritten note that said, "For Shadow, the fighter." But the biggest surprise came one afternoon when a knock echoed on Lucas's door. A man in his late 60s stood outside, hat in hand, eyes troubled. "You the one who found that black dog out near Pine Hollow?" he asked. Lucas nodded cautiously. The man hesitated. "I think I know who left him." Lucas stepped onto the porch, keeping a cautious hand near Shadow, who had started to growl low in his throat. The man standing in front of them looked weathered by time, with deep creases along his face and a layer of snow dusting the shoulders of his coat. His boots were old but polished. His eyes didn't flinch under Lucas's direct gaze. "I'm not here to cause trouble," the man said, holding up a hand. "Just thought you should know the whole truth." Lucas didn't say anything. He stepped aside slightly and motioned toward the bench near the firewood pile. The man nodded and sat, glancing briefly at Shadow, who stayed close to Lucas's side but didn't bark again. "They call me Roy," the man began. "I lived up near the ridge past Pine Hollow for over 30 years. My nephew Tyler stayed with me this past winter after his folks split. Wasn't an easy kid, real angry. Didn't treat animals right either." Lucas's chest tightened. He had a feeling where this was going, but he let Roy talk. "One day, back in late December, he brought home a stray, black shepherd mix, just like that one." Roy pointed slowly at Shadow, said it followed him back from a gas station. Dog was skittish but smart, stuck close to Tyler, even though the boy didn't deserve it. Roy paused and rubbed his hands. "Together, I told him if he couldn't take care of the dog, to let him go to ask for help, not handle it himself. But he didn't listen. One morning I woke up, and both Tyler and the dog were gone. A few days later, he came back alone." Lucas's expression darkened. "He didn't just leave the dog out there, did he?" Roy looked ashamed. "He said the dog ran off. I didn't believe him. A week later, I found a shell casing near the edge of our woods. He wouldn't talk. I made him leave. I couldn't stand it. Then I heard your story in town, saw the dog's picture. I knew right away." Lucas looked down at Shadow. The dog was sitting calmly now, staring at Roy with cautious eyes, as if recognizing something in the man's scent or tone. There was no fear, only awareness. "Why come here?" Lucas asked. "Why now?" "Because that dog deserves the truth," Roy said. "And so do you. I failed him once. I won't do it again." Lucas took a breath, feeling the heaviness of the past wrap around the cold afternoon. "I'm not looking for revenge. But if your nephew did what we both know he did, he shouldn't be trusted with any animal or people." "I understand," Roy said. "He left town, went south last I heard. But I'll speak to the sheriff. At least put a report down in case he resurfaces." Lucas nodded. "That's enough." Roy stood, tipped his hat, and looked at Shadow one more time. "He looks stronger now. Better than I remember." "He's more than strong," Lucas replied. "He's still here." Roy walked off into the snow without another word, and Lucas watched until he disappeared around the bend. Then he turned back inside, Shadow following closely behind him. That night, Lucas sat beside the fire with Shadow curled against his leg. The truth was difficult to accept, but it gave closure. The questions that once haunted him were now answered, and while the pain of what Shadow had endured remained, there was a kind of peace in knowing it was behind them now. In the days that followed, Lucas kept his promise. He contacted the sheriff, provided details, and submitted a full report based on Roy's account. There was little the law could do without Tyler's presence, but at least the story was documented. At least it wouldn't be buried in silence. Meanwhile, Shadow's progress accelerated. He began playing in the yard, chasing falling snow, and exploring short trails with Lucas at his side. The dog that had once trembled under porches now ran through open fields with cautious joy. The scars on his body remained, but they were only part of the story, now not the ending. And as winter began to thaw into early spring, Lucas realized something beautiful. Rescuing Shadow had started as a mission to save a life, but in the process, it had awakened something in his own life he hadn't known was missing: purpose, connection, and a bond that would never be broken. The last snow had melted into the soil by the time April arrived. The forest trails, once silent and white, began to bloom with new life. Patches of green peeked through the dirt, birds returned to the trees, and the rivers, once frozen in silence now, flowed with quiet strength. Shadow was walking without a limp now. It had taken months of slow rehabilitation, small exercises, and gentle encouragement, but the change was undeniable. His coat had thickened, his frame had filled out, and his eyes, once dull and guarded, now reflected curiosity and calm. Lucas watched him often, still amazed at the transformation. One morning, Lucas woke to find Shadow already at the cabin door, tail wagging, eager to start the day. It had become their routine. A long walk through the lower trail near the creek, followed by breakfast, then hours spent either exploring or working. Lucas had returned to freelance wildlife photography. He'd stopped for a while after Shadow's rescue, too overwhelmed to create, but now, inspired by the dog's resilience, he found meaning in the lens again. His photos mostly of wilderness, birds, and now Shadow began to gain attention online. One, in particular, of Shadow standing atop a hill with snow-capped trees behind him, went mildly viral. Messages poured in. People asked about the dog, about the story. Some wanted to adopt animals of their own. Others said they cried, reading what happened to Shadow. A few even asked if Lucas would consider creating a small blog or journal about their journey. At first, Lucas hesitated. He'd always been private, someone who preferred the quiet of trees over the noise of crowds. But he also saw what the story was doing, how it gave people hope. And hope, he realized, was something you couldn't keep to yourself. So, he started writing. He called the blog Shadow's Trail and posted once a week. Simple entries, stories from their walks, old photos from his ranger days, lessons he'd learned from Shadow's recovery. People responded with warmth and kindness. Some shared their own stories of rescuing animals or being rescued by them. Others simply thanked him for the reminder that even broken things can be made whole again. But Shadow wasn't just healing himself anymore. He was helping others. One day, Lucas received an email from a teacher at a nearby elementary school. She had shared Shadow's story with her class, and the students were so moved that they began a project called Second Chances, where each child wrote letters to local shelters, asking how they could help. The teacher invited Lucas and Shadow to visit the school for a short presentation. Lucas was hesitant. Shadow had never been around a large group of children, but something told him it was the right thing to do. When they arrived at the school, Shadow was nervous at first. The hallway smells, the echoing voices, the overwhelming energy, it was a lot. But Lucas knelt beside him, whispering gently, "Just like the forest, just new trees, that's all." And Shadow, as if understanding, followed him into the classroom. The children sat in a circle, wide-eyed and excited. Lucas shared their story, the snow, the rescue, the recovery, then let the kids meet Shadow one by one. Shadow wagged his tail softly, sniffed their hands, and even rested his head on a few laps. For many of those children, it was their first time connecting with a dog like that. One girl whispered, "He's like a superhero. He didn't give up." Lucas smiled. "Neither should you." As they left the school that day, Lucas felt something stirring in him again. It wasn't just about giving Shadow a second chance. It was about showing others how much change was possible with patience, love, and the refusal to look away. Back at the cabin, Lucas let Shadow off the leash and watched as he trotted ahead on the trail. The forest was full of promise again. The pain of winter had passed, replaced now by purpose, and somewhere deep inside, Lucas knew their journey wasn't just a rescue story anymore. It was a mission. One step at a time, they were both walking a new trail, leaving footprints that others could follow. Summer arrived quietly in the valley, painting the hills with wildflowers and waking up trails that had long slept under snow. Lucas and Shadow had settled into something like harmony. Their days were a mix of nature walks, photography trips, and moments of quiet companionship that needed no words. The blog, Shadow's Trail, had grown far beyond what Lucas expected. What started as a small reflection space had drawn thousands of readers, his inbox filled with messages from all over the country, teachers, animal lovers, rescuers, even veterans who saw pieces of themselves in Shadow's journey from pain to peace. One email stood out. It came from a woman named Jennifer Grant, director of a non-profit organization called Healing Companions, which paired trained rescue animals with trauma survivors. She wrote not just to praise the blog, but to ask a question that Lucas hadn't been expecting. Would you and Shadow consider joining our outreach team for part-time community events and workshops? She wrote. You wouldn't need to relocate, just attend when able. Your story has inspired so many already. We believe your presence and Shadow's could help even more. Lucas read the message 3 times. It felt too big, too official. He had never thought of himself as a speaker. And Shadow, despite all his progress, still had moments of hesitation in crowds. Yet, something tugged at him. He looked at Shadow, who was dozing peacefully by the fireplace, his tail occasionally thumping in his sleep. The thought of using their bond to help others stirred something in Lucas, an echo of the purpose he had felt years ago when he wore a ranger's badge and guided people through dangerous terrain. The next day, Lucas called Jennifer. They talked. For over an hour, she explained how their program worked, how some animals became therapy visitors, and others simply attended events to show what recovery looked like. Lucas wouldn't have to speak much, unless he wanted to. All they needed was his willingness, and Shadow's comfort. I don't know if he's ready for all that, Lucas admitted. Jennifer replied. You'd be surprised how far trust can carry someone. Or some dog. Lucas agreed to try. 2 weeks later, they were invited to a community retreat near Anchorage. It was small, just a few families and trauma survivors coming together for a weekend of healing, workshops, and stories. The drive was long, and Shadow watched out the window the whole way, his ears twitching at the passing scenery. When they arrived, Lucas noticed how open the space was, cabins spaced out across a green field, walking paths through wooded groves, and quiet stations for art and writing. Their first interaction came unexpectedly. A boy, no older than 10, sat alone near the edge of a pond. Lucas had noticed him earlier, keeping distance from everyone. Now, Shadow trotted toward him on his own. Lucas tensed, worried, but the boy didn't flinch. He watched Shadow approach, then slowly reached out a hand. Shadow sat down beside him, tail sweeping across the grass. For several long minutes, neither of them moved. Later, the boy's guardian approached Lucas with tears in her eyes. He hasn't spoken a word since February, she said, but after meeting your dog, he asked me what Shadow's name was. Lucas felt a lump rise in his throat. Over the next 2 days, Lucas and Shadow became quiet fixtures at the retreat. They didn't lead anything. They didn't perform. They were just present. And in that presence, people found comfort. Shadow became a walking reminder that healing wasn't always loud or fast, but it was possible. When the retreat ended, Jennifer approached Lucas as they were packing up. You two did more than you know, she said. No pressure, but if you ever want this to become something regular, the door's open. Lucas nodded. He didn't commit, not yet. But on the drive home, he couldn't stop thinking about that boy by the pond. About the unspoken connection between a child who lost his voice and a dog who once had no strength left to stand. Purpose, Lucas realized, wasn't always something you chased. Sometimes, it found you, walked beside you, and waited for you to catch up. The cabin was unusually still. Outside, the wind stirred the pine trees, casting long shadows across the wooden porch. Inside, Lucas sat at the table, staring down at an unopened envelope marked from Healing Companions. It had arrived 2 days ago, and he still hadn't touched it. The retreat in Anchorage had left a bigger mark than he expected. On the surface, it went well. Shadow had connected with people, made an impact, and handled everything with grace. But something inside Lucas had been unsettled ever since. It wasn't fear, exactly, but a creeping doubt. Was he really the right person to do this work? To be a voice for healing, when his own past wasn't fully healed? He had spent most of his life working in the wilderness for a reason. Trees didn't judge. Rivers didn't ask questions. Animals didn't demand explanations. But people needed things Lucas wasn't sure he had to give. Shadow lay nearby, chin resting on crossed paws, watching him quietly. He had become a mirror of Lucas's moods, always sensing when something was off. And right now, the tension in the room was thick enough to weigh down the air. Lucas finally reached for the envelope. Inside was an invitation to speak at a larger conference in Fairbanks, this time not just to attend, but to present. A short talk, a story session, and time with Shadow for any attendees who wanted to meet him. It was an honor, but it also meant stepping out of the quiet life he'd built since rescuing Shadow. He folded the letter again and stood, walking to the window. Outside, the last colors of evening were fading from the sky. Shadow followed, pressing his side gently against Lucas's leg. "I'm not sure I can do this," Lucas said aloud. "I don't know how to be anything more than what I am right now." Shadow didn't move. He just stayed close, the way he always did. The next morning, Lucas took Shadow for a walk to clear his head. They chose the long trail, the one that curved past the stream and cut through a quiet patch of forest. It had always been Shadow's favorite. He'd bound ahead for a while, stopped to sniff something, then wait for Lucas to catch up. But halfway through, a loud rustling came from the trees up ahead. Lucas froze. Shadow barked sharply and dashed forward. By the time Lucas reached him, Shadow was standing between a young girl and a steep drop, where part of the trail had collapsed due to a recent rainstorm. The girl, no older than 11, was trembling, clearly lost and disoriented. She must have wandered too far from one of the nearby campgrounds. Shadow hadn't growled or barked again. He stood calmly, tail swaying, as if he already knew she needed help. Lucas approached slowly. "Hey," he said softly, "are you okay?" The girl nodded, but didn't speak. She looked down at Shadow, then back up at Lucas. He offered her water from his pack and guided her away from the unstable edge. An hour later, they returned her safely to a park ranger who had just begun organizing a search. Her parents arrived minutes later, overwhelmed with relief. Through tears, the mother hugged Lucas and knelt to pet Shadow. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for finding her." Lucas didn't say much. He just looked at Shadow, who was now sitting calmly in the grass, as if it had all been part of his plan. That night, Lucas sat at his desk with the letter again. The doubts hadn't vanished, but something inside him had shifted. He thought about the little girl, the way Shadow had sensed the danger, the way he stood guard not out of fear, but instinct. Protection, presence. That's what they were offering people. Not perfection, just presence. Lucas took out a pen, scrawled yes across the response card, and placed it back into the envelope. As he sealed it shut, Shadow lifted his head from across the room, ears perked. Lucas smiled faintly. "Looks like we've got another trail to follow," he said. Shadow wagged his tail once. The morning sun broke through the mist like a golden thread, touching the tops of the trees and bathing the valley in soft light. It had been nearly a year since that storm, the one that changed everything. A year since Lucas had found a broken dog buried in snow, barely breathing, and carried him back from the edge. Now, Shadow walked beside him on a sturdy trail, just west of Pine Hollow, the same forest that once nearly claimed his life. His strides were strong and confident. His eyes were sharp and curious. If not for the faint scar on his hind leg, no one would guess he'd ever been hurt at all. Lucas hadn't meant to come back to this place. He hadn't planned it, but something had tugged at him, some quiet need to return, not to relive the pain, but to honor how far they had come. He paused near the clearing where he had first seen Shadow lying still in the snow. The forest looked different, brighter, full of birdsong and summer air. The trees no longer loomed like guards. They stood like silent witnesses, as if remembering what had happened here. Shadow walked ahead, sniffing at the underbrush before circling back to Lucas's side. He sat down and looked up, ears perked, as if asking, "Do you remember?" Lucas crouched beside him and ran a hand gently through the dog's thick fur. "I remember," he whispered, "but it doesn't hurt the same anymore." He pulled a small wooden marker from his pack. It wasn't a grave, Nothing had died here, not really. It was more like a tribute. He placed it beneath a tall pine tree and stepped back. Carved into the wood were just a few words: left behind, carried forward, never forgotten. Shadows trailed for a moment. Lucas stood in silence, letting the weight of it settle. Then he turned to Gobert, not before glancing back once more at the quiet clearing that had once held such sorrow. It held something different now. Not pain, not even healing, something deeper. A kind of peace. Back at the cabin that evening, Lucas poured a mug of tea and sat on the porch as the sun dipped behind the hills. Shadow lay beside him, his head resting on Lucas's boot, eyes half closed but still alert. The past few months had been more than just busy, they had been meaningful. Lucas and Shadow had attended 5 more events with healing companions. They had met veterans, children, grieving parents, recovering addicts, people from every walk of life. And each time, Shadow had offered them something simple and profound. His presence. He didn't bark. He didn't do tricks. He didn't need to. His story spoke louder than words ever could. And Lucas, quiet, private, once unsure, had found his voice again too. Not the kind of voice that filled stages or lit up crowds, but the kind that listened, that comforted, that connected. They had started getting invitations from across the country. Lucas hadn't said yes to all of them, but he kept the letters. Not for pride, but for perspective. Every one of them was proof that even something broken, be it a dog or a man, could still have a purpose. As night fell, stars bloomed across the sky. Lucas leaned back in his chair and looked up, thinking about all the moments that had led them here. The snow, the walk, the rescue, the silence that turned into trust, the bond that never asked for anything but gave everything in return. Shadow stood beside him and let out a deep, contented sigh. Lucas smiled. "You know," he said, "you weren't just saved, Shadow. You saved me too." Shadow's tail gave a soft thump, as if he understood perfectly. And there, in the quiet of the night, with the world resting in soft darkness and the trail behind them lit only by memory, Lucas realized something simple and true. Some stories aren't meant to end. They're meant to continue step by step, paw by paw, carving new paths, changing lives, and reminding everyone who hears them that even in the coldest snow, hope never dies.